All right, here we are one more time. It's been a few weeks. We've had some downtime. I took a trip for Feast of Tabernacles. That was awesome. A bit of vacation, and then Ken has relocated to Costa Rica, so we might be on a little bit of a delay. We're going to try to give him some gaps so he can jump in when he needs to. But been a great few weeks, and we've been missing this podcast and having this conversation. What else has happened over the last 3 weeks? Feels like it's been a lot longer and a lot more has been going on than that really characterizes. But I guess we could have a whole podcast just about that, right? But we want to talk about something else
Yeah.
today. Today's topic is interesting. Halloween's coming up, and we thought we'd kind of use that as a um, kind of a catalyst for a lot of different topics. But the main thing we were talking about just before we started recording was, um, oh, there, Ken's gonna go grab his tropical authenticity down there.
I know I got some genuine home country love. Somebody's cutting some coconuts in the background and he just gave me one. Feel
That's
super
awesome.
blessed. I'll go
That is
back on
awesome.
mute.
Whatever, dude. I like to hear the sound of the machete working back there. Um, in light of Halloween, man, everybody has a different take on this, and it's always a question: should believers participate? What's the Christian response to Halloween? What's the biblical response to Halloween? But even more fundamental than that, it raises a bigger question. It raises the question: are we living on autopilot, or are we living intentionally? Are we, the things that we do, are we doing because we've been taught and it's just the way we've always done them? It's the way everybody around us does them. With conviction, are we living in a manner that everything we do, every decision we make, um, we at least have some level of confidence that it's scripturally supported and that our King is pleased by it? And so we kind of just wanted to unpack that a little bit today. And man, I've got a ton to say on all that stuff, but you guys are going to have to interrupt me because I'll just keep going.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot to talk about there, and there's some really interesting paths and directions we can go. But mentioning Halloween, like I think maybe an interesting question for each of us could be like what did you guys do when you were kids? Like,
Mhm.
so for me, like my family and I'd never trick or treated before. I My parents were kind of they were aware that I think they asked that question, they're
Mhm.
like, okay, what does this mean? What is it about? And stuff. And so we just kind of never did it. I vaguely remember going to a couple harvest party things, but like I was telling you guys earlier, like where we eventually landed as a family, and it turned out to be one of my favorite holidays, is we instead of we didn't want to be home like for all the trick-or-treaters and stuff, and so we always went out to a movie and like a steak dinner or something like that, and that's just what we did, and that got more and more like awesome as the older I got and the more I appreciated meat. But
Hey, that would be my favorite holiday too.
yeah, and like I never really thought much of it. Like, as I got older, like if there was an event or like I was in a band, like sometimes we played at Halloween things for youth groups, harvest parties, things like that. I never really thought a lot about it. I still don't think that much about it. I think the shift for me was when I had kids and they were old enough to trick or treat and dress up and do the whole nine and they go to preschools and they do harvest festivals and all that. And then my wife had like a totally different experience growing up. She did I think her parents for a while were pretty like hardcore and didn't do any of that stuff. But once she hit high school and all that, I mean, they trick or treated and all that. So we took the kids trick or treating for the first time. It was my first time trick or treating was when my like 3-year-old went trick or treating or whatever. And so we went a few years ago, and I just haven't really thought that much of it. The kids like it and all that. So it's an interesting question for me because like I think I'm on the end of it. So
Mhm.
I don't know, I'll stop, let you guys go.
Yeah, I'll let Ken jump in because I know he's still getting the last few seconds of Shell's words there in Costa Rica.
Yeah, I think I'm most interested in asking the question that's changed everything, I believe, and is it, you phrase it differently, but I think you were saying, is it honoring to God? Is what I'm doing honoring to God, and should I be asking questions, or is it okay to run on autopilot? And that's just been a complete perspective change for me in so many areas.
Mm-hmm.
As a super young kid, we celebrated Halloween, no problems. We're a super worldly family. Came from a really broken home, and then ended up meeting Messiah when I was younger. And from then on, we kind of rejected it, and we never celebrated Halloween. And then about the time where I could like start going out on my own, I started hunting, and hunting season was always during Halloween, so I never even was around to see. I didn't even realize it was a big party, because at like 12, 13 years old, I was hunting every year. And then I went to college, and that year I couldn't go hunting, and it was like the biggest party, like holiday of the year, and I had no clue that I like thought it was like this kid's holiday. Like I just had missed that gap from like 12 to like 18 or 19, and so I couldn't go hunting, and everyone invited me to these big parties, and I was like, wow, this is a lot of fun, and I ended up going to all these Halloween parties, and so I started celebrating without really thinking a whole lot, and I asked some questions, but I always thought, like I'm not doing anything bad, I thought. And so I just kind of was on autopilot. Like everyone else I was around was going to these Halloween parties, and my faith-believing friends were going, and we just figured like, hey, we can integrate into the world and still be a light, and this is cool. And then 2 years ago, I asked a question of, it had nothing to do with Halloween, but it had to do with Christmas, and I said, is this honoring to God? And that changed everything I thought about Christmas, and subsequently that forced me to ask the question, are these other things I'm doing, including Halloween, honoring? And Halloween's this holiday I haven't had a chance to deeply study, so today's going to be a cool learning lesson for me. But I am so interested in the answer to that question, is even if it's not offensive to me, is it offensive to God? And is it honoring to Him? And my conclusion at this point in my life is that things that are pagan and that represent bloodshed of His people and represent turning, His people turning their backs on Him to follow practices of other gods is probably super dishonoring and hurtful, and so I want to stay away from it as I learn about those things.
Yeah, and it's an interesting question because not only is the question inherently fascinating, but we can come away with different answers, and I think part of the importance of the question itself is, how do we answer that question? It's one step to ask it, and that's critical. But then the second step is, how do we actually go about finding that answer? And this is an interesting topic for the three of us, because it sounds like we're in pretty different, obviously very different backgrounds and in pretty different places right now as of this moment. And as with other topics, we reflect, I'm sure, kind of a microcosm of all the different perspectives out there, at least some of them, at least three of them. And when I grew up, we lived way out in the country. I mean, I think there might have been some trick-or-treaters somewhere, but we never saw them or whatever, so we were fairly sheltered in a good sense, and we kind of didn't have to deal with it from that vantage point. And not that we would have, even if we had been in the city or whatever, but I guess it was probably a convenient environment for my parents to keep us out of that experience. And then, of course, when I was older, we moved to a much larger city, and I think a couple of years we had candy for the kids, just so we didn't have to deal with the hassle of of turning everyone away all the time. It was quite a big neighborhood. But for the most part, we would usually just turn our lights off or whatever, and then later on when we were married, when Renee and I got married, we would just shut our lights off in the house and go downstairs and hang out with our kids or whatever. So we always pretty much abstained, if you want to call it that, and tried to stay separate from that whole experience. We went to a couple church harvest parties, probably in junior high time frame or whatever, and I always wondered about that too. Like I wondered, hey, is this alternative valid? Like, is it's the same time, you're still dressing up, you're slapping a biblical theme on top of this thing, and you're basically doing all the same stuff. So that's another interesting question. But one of the kind of arguments I wanted to unpack was, in terms of answering this question, how do we how do we decide? Okay, yes, this is okay to participate in. No, it's not. And I think one of the questions that we run afoul, a lot of people run afoul of, is having the impression from teaching and everything else that things that might not have been okay before, or might have had a pagan origin, or might have started out, with evil intent, have now been redeemed by Messiah and can be, reclaimed or reclaimed. Or I think the logic is like, hey, he's remade everything, so now we can do it and put Christianity on top of it, and it's okay. And not as an only okay, it can also be a witnessing tool, or these kind of different concepts. So that's one kind of
Yeah,
argument I've heard.
for me, that's something that a lot of people have brought to my attention, and they've always gone back to um, like Exodus era, and they go to, Jacob had his 12 sons who were the 12 tribes of Israel, and Joseph was sold by his brothers into slavery, has a super hard life, ends up, um, and we could take that whole story apart at some other time, but God redeems the entire situation and transforms Joseph's life, and he is literally kind of like the redeemer of his people, and he saves them from the 7-year drought, and it's even his family and his brothers that sold him into slavery. And at the end of it, he says a really famous verse, which I should find before the end of the thing, but he says, what you intended for harm, Yahweh intended for good. And he's speaking to his brothers because they're like, we're so sorry, and he's saying, no, it's okay that this happened because God made a good thing out of it. And I've had a lot of people use that verse
Hmm.
and say, with any pagan symbols, anything, as long as it's good, like as long as their intention for it is good, it's okay because that verse is clearly stating that, even though people can use things for bad, God can redeem them for good. And that caused a lot of questions for me, and at the end of it, I ended up really diving deep into that. My conclusion was God redeems people, but he doesn't change physical things that were intended for bad things into good things. And I wish I had we've talked about this before, I know it's somewhere else, but there's a really good analogy for something bad that obviously God would not redeem.
Well, the enemy, I mean, Satan, for one thing, is Satan redeemable? I think the validity of any argument can be tested by taking it to the extreme and following the logic all the way down the path. And part of one of the things like that we've been talking about offline is just, how do we, with these conversations, one of our main point, if anybody listening takes away nothing else, it would be that, we want to help encourage people to kind of start exploring the way we're interested in exploring, and not just accepting anything at face value. And the main point is of this topic, of any other topic, to dive into it for yourself and explore it thoroughly. Don't just buy someone is teaching you or what everybody is saying around you. And in this case, yeah, I totally agree. Like, a great specific verse is 2 Corinthians 5:17 that talks specifically to that point of what does Yahweh redeem. And I agree 100%. I think it's people and not situations. And so to test the argument, you can say, well, could Satan be redeemed? And I think the answer is obvious. I think there's a point at which something is inherently evil, and it's inherently, I mean, that's its nature. And
Mm-hmm. Not even
the role of
evil.
Messiah was to go ahead. Yeah, jump in.
I was just going to say, one of the things I was thinking about is like a statue of the law. Not even saying like, just if we started worshiping that and calling it Yahweh, or let's say we made a golden calf, but we called it Yahweh, as the Israelites did at Mount Sinai, is, they intended it for good. I mean, they were so confused, like they built this golden calf when Moses was gone, and they said, you are, this is Yahweh, and they called him by his name. They called the calf by God's name, and they said, you rescued us from Egypt, and you split the sea. But I think that story is really clear because they slaughter, a huge portion of the people. that God is not okay with that, even though they intended it for good, right? They intended this golden calf for a good thing. And
Mhm.
modern day today, I think we could, we anything that we're tied to or really sensitive to, like something like a Christmas tree per se, or one of our holidays, we don't want to give that up, but we would easily say totally like it is not okay to worship a statue of Buddha or Allah or any of these other gods and intend it for good and call it Messiah or Jesus Christ or Yahushua.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. And that's kind of the same thing. I mean, could you bring um, a satanic heavy metal song into church and worship Yahweh with it? Like that's just not going to fly, you know.
Mhm.
And so I think that starts to pick apart at that argument that all things that anything can be used for good, even if it's intended for evil. So I think that the difference there is it's not all things, and I think the pattern that I've seen, and you see it throughout Scripture, you know, Father creates, the Creator makes something good, and the enemy corrupts it, taints it, pollutes it, contaminates it, and we're so used to the contamination that it's hard to recognize what the pure is anymore. And so we kind of get this comfort level with the world, and we think that it's very easy to think, hey, if I can appeal to the world, I can get their interest, and then I can witness to them. I can tell them about the truth or whatever. But I think that's a really dangerous approach.
I ha Can we back it up a sec? Like,
Yeah.
can you guys remember? Like, I feel like I just read this not too long. The story that Ken was talking about with the calf and stuff, and I feel like right before they did that, like God blatantly said, "Don't do that," and then they did it anyways because Moses was on the hill and on Mount Sinai, and they were freaked out that he's not coming back or wondering if he was ever coming back. So they like were like, "Oh, we have an idea," and I feel like it was pretty much stated, "Hey, don't do this." And I think to tie that in, number one, is that accurate?
Oh no, we just lost Shaw. Um, yeah,
Might press refresh.
while he's while he's going back, we'll start to
So,
put that together. So Exodus 20 is where um,
I don't know what
the
happened.
command was given. I don't know. You just got booted. All right.
Um,
yeah,
Yeah. Keep
yeah. So
going.
was
I
that
thought it was
accurate?
Exodus 30.
Well,
Yeah, yeah. So the stories in Exodus 30, 31,
mhm,
the sequence of events. Exodus 20, they get the Ten Commandments,
mhm,
and Yahweh says flat out, you know, do not make a graven image, do not bow down and worship it. So you have the progression from Exodus 20 where they get the instruction. They're told, you know, don't do this.
right.
What's interesting about that instruction, like Ken is pointing out, is like, you know, the instruction is don't make an idol, don't worship it.
Hmm.
Um, and again, like for context, they're coming out of Egypt where an idol was the only mechanism they're used to for worshiping a deity. So
Hmm.
that's all they know, for
Right.
example. And so Father's trying to correct that and say, look, don't do this. It's not acceptable. I am not like the gods of the Egyptians. Don't make idols and bow down to them. And then if you zoom forward in Exodus 30, 31, let's see where it starts
30,
exactly. 32?
32 is where they start. I just had it, but I lost it.
Yeah, and Exodus 32:1, if you know, for the full story, when the people saw that Moses was taking so long in coming
Hmm.
down from the mountain, um,
Yeah. Yeah.
and then it goes on from there.
So
But yeah, that was. Oh, sorry.
no, go ahead. Go
I
ahead.
was just gonna say, I when I read this for myself, probably 10, 15 years ago, something like that. You know, I knew this story growing up as a child. I mean, this is a pretty common Sunday school type story.
Hmm.
So I knew this story, but when I read it for myself, I saw it for the first time, like how like I saw everything that was there, and it was like a light bulb went off because it read differently than the impression that I had in my mind, and that's why it is so critical to read for yourself. It is you cannot get truth from storybooks or or Sunday school teachers or whatever. Those can be valuable resources, but you've got to read it for yourself. And the verse I want to zoom in on that kind of just exploded in my
Four?
brain. Uh, let's see. What's that? Verse.
Verse 4 is the one that, like, when I reread it,
Yeah,
I had never
verse
seen
4.
it before.
Yeah.
I, just
Um,
realizing that they call this calf, they believe it's their redeemer, the one that literally just pulled them out of Egypt.
yeah, well, and even
I just
verse
thought they were
5.
making a new golden calf, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, you think that I had the same impression. It seems like they're just worshiping an idol, but no, I mean, even in verse 5, Aaron saw and built an altar before it, meaning the golden calf, and Aaron called out and said, "Tomorrow is a festival to Yahweh, to Yod He Vav He, to the name, to Hashem." Um,
Hmm.
so so yeah, so here's this kind of intent where um, they've built this golden calf, and now they're trying to use that mechanism to worship their deliverer.
Yeah, and we should read verse 4 real quick. It says, "And he took this from their hand, and he formed it with an engraving tool." And when he says he took this from their hand, if you read before, it's all the gold that they brought, so that they could make this golden calf. So he took this from their hand and formed it with an engraving tool and made a molded calf. And they said, "This is your mighty one, O Israel, that brought you out of the land of Egypt."
Yeah, and I think what I've been learning is, and this, I mean, this applies to Halloween. It applies on so many levels to so many other things. It's a great principle. Um, as far as a litmus test, and how do we answer this question? What is pleasing to our king? What is not pleasing to our king? This is one example. Another fantastic example is 2 Kings 17:41, and I think, and I'll read it in a second, but I think what I've been learning is that the thing that's an abomination to our Creator, that's unacceptable to Him, is this mixture of taking something like the golden calf and mixing it with worship to Him, or introducing it into our activities. Um, and in 2 Kings 17, at the end of the chapter, you can obviously, you've got to read the whole chapter for context, but starting in verse 41, it says, "And they did not obey, but did according to their former ruling," or former ways. "So these nations were fearing Yahweh and serving their carved images. Both their children and their children's children, as their fathers did, they are doing to this day." And that whole chapter is, it's right kind of smack dab in the middle of the Kings, where it's talking about you got a couple righteous kings, but for the most part you've got very wicked kings who are perpetuating idolatry in Israel, and eventually leading to Israel's judgment. But very clear cut, like they're worshiping Yahweh, fearing Him, and serving idols, and it's this mixture that I think um, displeases our Father.
Hmm.
I think it's so where I was kind of wondering or thinking in my head is like where do you start, I guess, or where do people like for me, like a lot of the time with holidays, I've just never even thought about it and stuff like
Hmm.
what is the origin of this and like and that's just like a change in like thinking, right? Like getting better at okay, I'm doing something, I'm physically acting on something or like celebrating something. Maybe I should understand better what it is, and I think that goes for many things. But holidays is a great example, and I think lots of people that they're just not even associating it like with anything that could be wrong, and so like I guess that's the challenge is like getting there, like getting to the place where like okay, I should question this, I should learn about this. What is it? And then asking like, okay, what does the Bible say about this? And like I think it's hard for I read this and like I have a different perspective now than I did maybe even a few months ago where it's like okay, like reading through the Ten Commandments or whatever, reading that story and saying, okay, like no idols and images, and it's just like, okay, so then you like fast forward to now, and you're thinking, what is an idol? Like lots of people would never think uh, a Christmas tree or anything like that. Like it's a tree, to most people, like they wouldn't think. And so like again, like understanding like where something comes from, and then like determining what the Bible says about it, and then like also I think one of the huge things is like and we've been saying it the whole time here is like read for yourself. Like don't
Mhm.
take a book's word for it. Don't
Or our word
take
for it.
Yeah, don't take like even like you guys are like my best friends, and it's just like just because you guys say something, like I put a lot of stock in it, but it would be um
Irresponsible.
irresponsible of me to just take
Hmm.
it and say, yeah, like I like Andrew and Ken so much, like they would never try to hurt me, and like you guys wouldn't, but like that doesn't mean that you're right or wrong, and just be and the two like I I think prayer is like a huge thing like in here, and it's like I've never sat down and said, God, like what do you think about this? What should I be doing? What does your word say? Help me to read it, understand it, do it, and like obey, because like a lot of it is cloudy, and when you grow up and you're like in it, and so I mean it's weird because it's not like even we didn't really celebrate Halloween since we're talking about we did Christmas and all that, and it would be some things would be harder to let go than others, I think.
Hmm.
And then yeah, like the tradition of it, and then like I was watching that Truth or Tradition podcast that Jim Staley did, and that was
Hmm.
really interesting, really challenging. And he said like, and I was saying it in my head while I was watching it. He's like, what did he said? Oh, he's like just because like I don't celebrate it that way. Like that's not why I'm celebrating it, even if
That's
it
not
means
what I
something
mean.
like yeah, not what it
Not what it
means
means
to
to
me
me. Yeah.
and stuff. And like that was a really challenging thing because like I've said that so many times in my head. I'm like, well, that's not what it means for me, so it's probably okay. And like I think that's just another opportunity to ask the question, is it? Like, have I prayed about that? Am I
Mm.
just justifying it because I want to be comfortable still? And I'd say like in my personal life, yeah, like I've done that. I've totally justified it and like not dug on purpose. Like I didn't even want to watch that truth or tradition thing. Like, cause I didn't,
It's scary. Yeah.
yeah, I was like, I don't want to change all those things. Like, that's what I know. That's what I've grown up with. Like, we have a lot of like family stuff like tied up in these things. And so it's like,
Mhm.
it's hard to make a change. And then it's like, not only personally, but then you're looking at your family in the face and saying, hey, like, I want to do this. And like, it causes like issues and stuff. But I think there's, obedience isn't, it's not free or it's not easy, you know?
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
so,
Yeah.
but yeah, like I think Bible and then like prayer is like key. You just can't rely on a book or even your best friends, you know?
Mhm. Yep.
Yeah. I think that what you said about not being able to just trust us and that everything we say is pure truth, it's because you are accountable for your own actions at the end of the day. And so, as you said, it would not be wise to just blindly trust us. And the Bible talks a lot about everything, even great teachers. If Paul was here today speaking, we should test and approve everything he says against the
Mm,
Word. And so, to me, that same idea of you're going to be accountable for what you believe, and you need to test and approve it to the Word. I think that same principle is we're not we should we are accountable for everything that we do, and so it's hard, but we probably should be asking the question, why do I do this? And so to me, that's where
mhm.
the holidays and other things come in. Like, it's not like, yeah, I didn't even know that, like you said, where to even begin, because you don't know. And I think it's just, if you're doing something, you should know why you're doing it, because you're going to be held accountable for that.
Well,
No
and I
one's forcing you to do these things.
yeah, and I think it's a question of identity, and I think a lot of times we don't understand our identity, and so that's why there's this confusion about what kind of behaviors are acceptable or not acceptable. If I'm trying to think of a good analogy, nothing's coming to me right off the top of my head, but if you were, if you were a banker, for example, would it be acceptable for, for you to be fraudulent? That's a horrible analogy, but the idea is there's a much worse accountability there because you have access to and you can manipulate numbers and all of that. And so if your identity is based in something that you have a gift for, and you're using that, and as a poor bad steward being criminal with it, then that's totally different than if you're just making an innocent mistake and when you're trying to balance your checkbook, and that's kind of that's a stretch. But what I'm getting at is, we don't understand our identity in Messiah, and we don't understand a lot of times why we're who we have become after we were bought with the price. And going back to that verse I threw out earlier, 2 Corinthians 5:17, because this really speaks to the heart of what does Father redeem, what is redeemed, what is made new. So I just wanted to read this and then piggyback on it with one more verse to kind of answer this identity question, because it starts to solve a lot of these questions about specific participation when we understand our identity. So starting out in 2 Corinthians 5:11, knowing therefore the fear of Yahweh, we persuade men, but we have been made manifest to God, and I also trust in your consciences to have been manifested. For we do not again commend ourselves to you, but give an occasion to boast on our behalf, in order that you have an answer for those who take pride in appearance and not in heart. For whether we are beside ourselves, it was for Elohim, or whether we are of sound mind, is for you. For the love of Messiah, and this is where I really want to zoom in, for the love of Messiah compels us, having judged this, that if one died for all, then all died. And he died for all, that those who live should no longer live for themselves, but for him who died for them and was raised. So from now onwards we know no one according to the flesh. And if we have known Messiah according to the flesh, yet now we no longer know him thus. Therefore, if any person, if any man, if any woman is in Messiah, he or she is a renewed creature. The old matters have passed away, and see, all matters have become new, or renewed is probably a better translation from the Greek. And so we see that, like, in that context, it's talking about the renewal is of people. And so we are new creations. And for example, would you take a brand new mug and use it to store like grease and stuff? Like, would you put garbage in a vessel that is just been remade, that's just been made and fit for a particular purpose? You can't. You wouldn't do that. Logically, that wouldn't make sense. And we can kind of see that identity shift if we jump forward to, same book, 2 Corinthians 6. Hold on, I'm going to turn the monitor off. We've got our monitor on left on from last night. There we go. Sorry about that. 2 Corinthians 6. And this, for me, this is like one of the most kind of concise and decisive verses on the entire topic. And we don't often think about holiness or set apartness in such dramatic terms as this, but this really lays it out and convicts me. The whole chapter is awesome, but for interest of time, I'll just start at verse 16. So this is 2 Corinthians 6:16. And what union has the dwelling place of Elohim with idols? For you are a dwelling place of the living Elohim. As Elohim has said, I shall dwell in them and walk among them, and I shall be their Elohim, and they shall be my people. Therefore, come out from among them and be separate, says Yahweh, and do not touch what is unclean, and I shall receive you. And I shall be a father to you, and you shall be sons and daughters to me, says Yahuwah the Almighty. Powerful, powerful verse, and would a, and where a lot of people get hung up is they see Yahushua, they see Jesus, invading the worldly scene and bringing light into that environment, but the confusion is that they think then they need to appeal to the world, and that's not what Messiah did. And so there's this in but not of, there's this engaging but not participating, and that's hard to understand because our identity is rooted in Him, and there is a complete separation. Oil and water, they can be in the same container, but they're not going to mix, like that kind of concept. Whereas I think a lot of times the temptation is, if we appeal to the world, we'll get their ears, and then we can have a ministry opportunity.
Hmm.
But
Yeah, I was thinking, like, I kind of thought of it early on in the conversation, but uh, the verse about like not conforming to the patterns of the world and stuff like that, and
hmm
I was just thinking about that verse and how challenging it can be, and like
hmm
my main question with that is, it's what are the patterns of the world? It's time to define those, like at least in my personal journey, like and and just okay, like what's different? What should I not be conforming to? And like, what is an idol? What is not an idol? What, it's just it's another opportunity to ask the question and stuff and do like a check and an audit, and say what do I believe? Like why
hmm
am I doing X, Y, Z? Am I conforming? So I don't know. It goes kind of right along with a lot of the stuff you just read. Um,
yeah,
but yeah,
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 it's good.
I think you have to know, back to these questions, what you just said is this, what are its origins and what are the roots of it, So, I mean, we're kind of talking about Halloween, so part of it would be to understand a little bit of the roots for Halloween, and then for each of us maybe to talk briefly, or I don't know if we have any conclusions, but what we think about being able to, how are we a light, and what would what do we think would be the appropriate biblical response to celebrating Halloween? And it's super tough, like, especially as you get kids and families involved or past traditions and stuff.
yeah. I mean, I've always felt like it's impossible to help someone out of the mud if you jump in there with them. Like, and again, that analogy could be misconstrued a little bit too, because you would say, well, jump in the mud, get humble yourself and
I might have lost him.
One
Let's see if he
second.
comes back. Here he comes. Okay, here he comes. I see his little thumbnail, but not him. Oh, there you go. Not sure we have audio, Andrew.
there we go. I'm
There you go.
assuming we're still recording. Hey, it
Yep.
yeah, kicked me out and said the podcast had ended or whatever, but I'm glad it didn't kill the whole thing. Um, Yeah, so someone would say, well, yeah, you should get down in there and help them out or whatever, but I think it's the same concept as, put your oxygen mask on first and then help everyone else around you. Like, you're not going to be any good to someone if you pass out.
Well,
And
if
if you
everybody's in the mud, who's gonna pull
exactly,
them out?
exactly, like
Yeah.
if you do jump in, then and you get stuck, now what, right? And so I think with Halloween specifically, a homework assignment, if you don't know the history of Halloween, research it. It's very, it's all out there. It's very accessible. It just 2 quick seconds on it. I mean, yeah, and everybody has this general impression. Well, Halloween's got this stigma. It's maybe it was evil originally, but now it's just a cultural thing or whatever. But really research it out, because there's some really dark things about it. And would we give our wives an anniversary card with a swastika on it or a pentagram on it or something and say, oh, I decided this means a really nice thing to me, and I'm going to give you this anniversary card with this really offensive symbol on it because I've redefined what it means. It doesn't work that way. Um, so go research Halloween, and also for homework, look up Haggai chapter 2. That's also got a lot of good stuff in there that delineates what can be redeemed, what makes something unclean, and what makes something clean. Can something that is unclean be made clean? And that's another fascinating chapter to look at. But I think in terms of Halloween, and even zooming out a little bit now, to kind of drive this to a conclusion, I think the bottom line is we need to ask more questions. Why do we do things? What if let's make it super real. Let's look at our our monthly budget. How much money do we spend on entertainment a month? How much money do we spend on trivial things that could go somewhere else? And you can really start to unpack that and go pretty far with it And then someone might say, well, at what point do you start getting legalistic? And legalism's a whole nother interesting topic, but I think would anybody say you're being legalistic by stopping at every stop sign? I don't think so. There's reason for those protections. That you're preserving life. So I think people get wrapped up around legalism um, incorrectly, and I think they apply it incorrectly when there's zealous obedience to what the Creator has established. You know, can you be legalistic by not throwing yourself out of an airplane without a parachute? Is that being legalistic to gravity? No, that's just respecting the law of gravity. And so when we respect the Creator's laws, I don't think you can call that legalism, even if it's passionately done or zealously done. Legalism, I think, is defined accurately as placing man's above God's laws and doing things that the Creator didn't establish, and making a religion or an idol out of those things. And on that note, I think we can pretty much wind down. Any other last second thoughts from you guys?
No, I mean, I think legalism would be a great topic at some point, but just like
Yeah, we
to
could.
stack something on there real quick. I think don't, and this is something I've struggled with greatly, is if you are asking the question, like I've asked myself, various questions, especially like over the probably past 2 years, and I find myself getting frustrated, like with the answer that I'm receiving back from the Lord or the Bible or whatever, and like I get frustrated. I'm like, well, I can't do it all, and I think that's a really important thing to remember. Is yeah,
Mhm.
you can't, like, step at a time, like, and I think that's sometimes legalism gets thrown into that whole idea where it's just like, well, if you're doing that, well, why do you do these things? It's just like, well, dude, calm down. Let me figure out this, and
Mhm.
then we can figure out B, C, D. You don't have to do it all at once. You don't have to like jump all in there. It's just like, okay, I love the homework assignment. Like, let's go figure out like what Halloween is, and like pray and
Mhm.
read and see what the Lord says, and see what He's telling me to do for my family, And like there there's gonna be some consistencies across the board, I think, if we're like honestly approaching that. And then I think He might ask me to do something a little more because maybe I'm hanging on different.
Mhm.
I don't
Yeah.
know.
Well, and exactly. And I can't tell you or Ken or anyone like this is what you should
Hmm.
do. I can only, before my Creator and my conscience, do with my life, because that's what I'm accountable for.
Yep.
And you guys are accountable for your lives. And I
Mm.
think the fundamental point is, let's be intentional about that, and not do anything without a conviction that, yeah, we are, this is pleasing to our Creator, and let's keep doing it. And like you said, that is a long progression. I mean, life is a journey, and if we're just faithful to be obedient each step as we get it, we'll get the next step, and we'll just keep moving that way.
Mm.
Mhm.
Awesome.
Yeah, I
Cool.
think,
Yeah, go ahead, dude.
yeah, I echo all that, and I think, the one thing that I love the homework assignment, and I would just echo is, like, I think it's worth understanding at minimum why we do it. Whatever you choose to do, you should know why you do it, and it'd be worth knowing the origins. Um,
Hmm.
and so walking through that would be good. And I loved your last thoughts, Shawl, and just sometimes when you pursue a path like this, people will say, well, why aren't you doing all these things? And it's like, you're trying. The idea is trying to be obedient with what you've been given, and that it's a journey. And so, yeah, I think we should all do our best to take every step in that journey and be obedient with the truths that Father's revealing to us along the way.
Yep.
Absolutely. Awesome. Um, well, that should make a fun next one. So
Oh yeah.
hopefully we can jump on next week, even though I'm gonna be on vacation. So,
Oh yeah.
all right, cool. Well, I'm gonna shut it down.
All right, shut it down.